Michael, Garrett, thanks for joining me on New Mexico in Focus. I'm really glad to have you two here today to talk about PFAS. Michael, I'd like to start with you and your coverage in New Jersey. First of all, welcome back to New Mexico PBS. We miss you here in New Mexico. New Jersey is a state that's well known for manufacturing. But when it comes to the PFAS contamination, are we talking about manufacturing? Are we talking about the military? Kind of what's the big issue in New Jersey?
So in New Jersey, we get it from everywhere. You're right. We're an industrial state. We've got a big legacy of chemical manufacturing here, and that's where a large source of the contamination around us is coming from. We do have our fair share of military bases, the largest of which is the Joint Base down in the Pine Barrens. And that actually has, according to the Environmental Working Group, one of the highest known levels of PFAS that the DoD has found in their kind of initial round of testing. So that's a significant source, but I think if you're looking at the picture holistically, pollution from chemical companies and chemical plants has been the state's primary concern.
And what are the different tactics that the state has taken in trying to either compel cleanup, stop pollution from the manufacturing side, from the military side?
In New Jersey, especially as the state has gotten more serious about the issue, the primary tactic has been lawsuits. And that really started under our previous commissioner for the State Department of Environmental Protection. Her name was Catherine McCabe, and she was a veteran of the DOJ's environmental wing. And so she directed the state in conjunction with the Attorney General to really rely on the courts in bringing pressure down on companies to compel cleanup. It's a slow-moving process. A lot of these cleanups have not begun yet, and the court cases are still playing out.
And I believe it was earlier this year, like maybe around January, you were covering the state's lawsuit with the Defense Department. What's the strategy there, and where does that lawsuit stand right now?
I think with that particular lawsuit, Laura, I think you will be able to relate to it with New Mexico's experience. The state sued the Department of Defense for contamination, particularly focused on Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst, but also with concerns related to Naval Weapons Station Earl and the former Naval Air Warfare Center in Trenton, which is now closed. In all three cases, the state regulators have just become frustrated by a lack of action from the Department of Defense, particularly as New Jersey has moved forward with setting statewide drinking water standards for PFAS. And they chose to file the lawsuit out of that frustration. Like most lawsuits related to the topic, it got sent to federal court in South Carolina, and that's where it sits today.
So Garrett, Michigan has been dealing with the PFAS contamination issue for a lot longer than New Mexico has. I'm curious, the state has taken some interesting steps from my mind, watching from a distance. Can you talk a little bit about how the state of Michigan has tried to tackle the problem with respect to the military contamination?
Sure. Actually, the state of Michigan looked to New Jersey quite a bit early on, about 4 or 5 years ago, when they were starting to develop some of its state drinking water standards. So in regards to the military, the state of Michigan has not taken the step of taking them to court. It's mostly been sort of administrative disputes over state criteria and the way that that's being enforced. In Michigan, there is a significant amount of military contamination. The most significant and most high profile of those is the Wurtsmith Air Force Base in Oscoda. But there are issues at, say, Selfridge Air National Guard base near on Lake St. Clair. There's an K.I. Sawyer, a former Air Force base up in the UP. And, but the military piece is only a smaller fraction of the overall contamination picture in Michigan, which tends to largely be centered on sort of a commercial industrial type of contamination. So if your viewers have ever heard of the Wolverine Worldwide issue in the Kent County area near Grand Rapids, it's a footwear manufacturer, Hush Puppies shoes, Merrell sandals, that sort of thing. And that's the most severe example of the contamination in Michigan. It's a 25 square mile contaminated area, incredibly high levels in drinking water wells and rivers that are affected, and it's a pretty big deal. But the state's been dealing with SCOTA and Ward Smith Air Force Base the longest, and it's really where the first place where they discovered the chemicals back in 2010. And so it's been a lot of push and pull with the Air Force, trying to get them to adhere to state standards after they were developed, trying to get them to do more with, respect to cleanup. And it's just a really long, slow process. It gets dragged out. It's the Air Force follows this Superfund process known as CERCLA. And they love to say that. They love to say the acronym CERCLA and the CERCLA process. In fact, it's something of a drinking game, among journalists who cover that. So it's just it's an ongoing thing. The Michigan's Governor Gretchen Whitmer is right now, and just recently, as of this spring, invoked a provision in a recent defense authorization bill that, in an attempt to force a new agreement with the Department of Defense and trying to, hasten things and get things sort of moving more quickly and get the Air Force to adhere to the state's groundwater standards and, treatment water discharge standards and all these little small things that the Air Force pushes back on. And they pretty much push back on just about everything. So in terms of the military picture, it's not quite the same as New Jersey. It hasn't really run through the courts as much, but it's an issue that the state regulators just, are highly, highly frustrated with.
Yeah. So here in New Mexico, the push really has been, we need EPA to set federal regulations. There needs to be a federal standard, and then the state can hold the military accountable. What about these individual state drinking water standards? How have those played out, and are they enforceable? Let's start with New Jersey.
Sure. So we actually have 3 drinking water standards in place in New Jersey. The first one was put in place in 2018 for PFNA, which, as far as PFAS goes, is one of the lesser known or talked about ones. And that's because in South Jersey, around a chemical plant run by the company Solvay, in around 2013, we found really severe PFNA contamination in municipal drinking water. There was a bit of a crisis. There was bottled water handouts. And in response to that, the state developed drinking water standards, PFNA. Those were put in place in 2018. It was followed in 2020 by standards for PFOA and PFOS, which are much more common. And the way it works in New Jersey is the levels in a municipal system are assessed on a quarterly basis, and it's kind of like averages for the previous year. So you needed to wait a year for enforcement to kick in. And now we're at that point where the state is starting to hand out violations to drinking water systems that are over the limit. And we're seeing that. That's a bit of reporting that I'm checking in on right now. But I know that there's at least 5 community water systems in the state that have PFOS violations on the books, and will need to address that situation. So that raises another really big question that no one at this point has an answer to, which is, treating PFAS in water systems it takes really expensive equipment that up to this point, water systems have not needed. So who's going to pay for that? equipment, and who's going to pay for the ultimate remediation of the mess. That's all to be determined.
What about Michigan, Garrett?
So in Michigan, in 2018, the state took the step of deciding it would test all of the public drinking water supplies in Michigan. And that was initiated following the Wolverine Worldwide contamination. It put a pretty big spotlight on Michigan's Republican governor at the time, Rick Snyder, who you may have heard of, related to the Flint water crisis. So he was looking to, to not get involved in another drinking water issue where it looked like the state government was, asleep at the wheel. So they started testing all the drinking water supplies around Michigan, and they found some. I think it ended up being about 1.5 to 1.9 million people were being served by a municipal supply or a public supply that had at least trace levels of the chemicals. And so they started doing some toxicology reviews of the literature around PFAS contamination and its impact on people's health. And in 2018, Governor Gretchen Whitmer was elected, and one of the first things she did in the spring of 2019 was initiate the promulgation of state-specific drinking water standards which are enforceable. And so it took a better part of a year and a half or so there to get through that process. It's a complicated process. Even at the state level, at the federal level, it takes several years and is even more complicated. But the state process, it can move a little more quickly. And so in August 2020, in sort of the midst of the pandemic summer, those standards were passed the state legislature, which declined to act to stop them. There's a joint committee that gets to look at that stuff. And then they took effect. And so, the state has 7 chemicals, PFAS chemicals, which it regulates in drinking water. And the lowest, I believe, is, PFNA, which is, I think, at 6 parts per trillion. PFOA is 8. PFOS is 16, so it's similar to some of the other state drinking water standards around the country. But certainly not the most strict, I believe. Maybe PFNA is nationally, but the state is moving through the administrative process now with the utilities. Those are enforceable standards, and there's quarterly sampling that's done at drinking water systems around the state. There's some of those systems are probably going to have to be installing treatment measures like activated carbon or reverse osmosis, which I think for at a public utility scale, it's most likely to go with the granular activated carbon. But it's something that was sort of moving along in sort of a typical regulatory fashion in some cases until actually this summer or this spring when 3M filed a lawsuit to try and invalidate those standards. And so that's sort of where things are at with them. They were, they haven't been struck down or anything by a judge, but they are being challenged.
The state standards that you're talking about seem much smaller, much more strict than the EPA's recommended health advisory, which is 70 parts per billion. You're talking much lower numbers and much lower exposures. Garrett, you've done some really great reporting recently in the past couple of months around the the Wurtsmith Air Force Base. And that PFAS contamination, unlike here in New Mexico, where the contamination is largely contained, but not entirely contained to these large Air Force bases themselves. But with Wurtsmith, that's not the case. And I'd just like to highlight a paragraph in one of your recent stories about the town of Oscoda, Michigan. And you wrote, the PFAS problem has become an economic and social burden from which there appears to be no end in sight. Hotel owners say it drives cancellations. Realtors say it tanks housing deals. Residents worry about how it may impact their property values. Elected officials call it a time suck that's raising utility and infrastructure costs. And few, if any, are satisfied with the pace at which the Air Force is cleaning up the problem. What has the military done at this point?
Well, so the military has done some things in Oscoda. The problem, in Oscoda dates back before most people really knew much about PFAS in Michigan or elsewhere. And so in 2014, I think the first granular activated carbon groundwater extraction treatment system was at a military site anywhere. It was actually installed at Worth Smith Air Force Base in Oscoda. And that's installed at the fire training site where they just used, liberal amounts of AFFF firefighting foam to train with. And it's right next to a marshland, which is part of the AuSable River, complex, and which dumps into Lake Huron. And so, there's been work happening around this issue since 2014, but it's not a lot. It's sort of a drop in the bucket to the overall size of the issue. And so, it's been a sort of a slow push and pull to get the Air Force to do more over time. And so because the Air Force uses 70 parts per trillion, which you just mentioned, the EPA's health advisory level, as their action level, not the state drinking water standards, they've only hooked up like 1 or 2 homes to municipal drinking water. Whereas if those standards, if they were dealing with standards that were far lower, the state standards, those hookups would be, the Air Force would be on the hook for many more of them. It's been a largely dealt with as a natural resources issue to some degree versus a public health issue at Worth Smith. And that's, a bit of a topic of debate among, the various folks who exist in the Oscoda community, in the state regulatory community, even at the federal level. It's, how big is the threat here? There's a lot of people on private wells around Oscoda, but it's sort of a smaller northern Michigan rural community. So it's not like it's densely populated, lots of people in one place drinking from a highly contaminated aquifer. These people are spread out. Many of them are drinking contaminated groundwater, but it's somewhere under 70 parts per trillion, and the Air Force isn't gonna, really do anything for that. And so what they are being forced to deal with is the natural resources, the contaminated marsh where some of the most highly contaminated fish ever found anywhere in the world are found right next to the Air Force Base. A lake that's very popular with fishing and boating, and it's just this foam. It's almost like reconstituted AFFF. It just forms on the shoreline, and you go there, and it's obvious, and it's this piles of foam that sometimes blow inland when it's a windy day. And, those are the sorts of things that people in Oscoda are upset about. And this is a northern Michigan hunting, fishing community. It sort of lives and dies on the tourism dollars that, people bring to it every summer. And so, you have a contamination issue, there's automatically a stigma issue associated with that. And so you get, various points of views from people who live in that community. Some people are very up in arms about it and want something done and want to shout from the rooftops. And other people are like, well, let's just deal with this internally here and locally and not, get people skittish and, who decide to vacation elsewhere. So it's that paragraph you read is my best attempt to sort of summarize the way that issue is being is manifesting itself in Oscoda. It's just it kind of pervades everything and becomes just adds a struggle element that really wouldn't otherwise be there.
Right. What about in New Jersey? What action has the military taken either toward cleanup or providing drinking water to people or filtration systems to people whose water's been contaminated?
I honestly, Laura, I'm not sure I could fully answer that question because I've been so focused on the chemical company side of things. My best answer to that is that the state feels that the military has not done enough.
Right. So what about people whose drinking water has been contaminated by manufacturers? Who pays for their sort of mitigation of their water?
Well, that's a great question. I think that the best example comes from South Jersey, the Gloucester County area, which is where the Solvay plant that has been the center of so many of so much trouble is located. That was where they found the high levels of PFNA back around 2013. At that point in time, Solvay, who has never taken responsibility as being the source of the contamination, did pay to hand out bottled water as wells were tested. Many municipal wells that were found to have particularly high levels were taken offline. So it's a strain on those municipal systems to figure out where they're going to get water from instead. Beyond that, the systems have had to install kind of filters either at the wells or in their treatment plants. There's a lot of homeowners down there with private wells, so they need filters for their homes when the water comes in. The state has helped paid for some of those, and I would need to double check, but I believe Solvay has also helped pay for some of those as well. And so the water situation down there is, for the most part, better, right? Like the contamination is there, but the water is drinkable because the filters have in recent years been installed. That's not across the board. One of the towns in the affected area is a town called National Park. And they recently were issued a violation from state regulators for having PFNA over the state limit in their drinking water. So they still have work to do to figure out the issue. But that is generally in places where the contamination has been found. It really falls on the local water system, whether it be municipally owned or a private company, whatever it may be, to handle it themselves. To that extent, even a couple weeks ago, or I should say earlier in June, a handful of municipalities in New Jersey, led by the city of Camden, sued 3M, DuPont, and other chemical companies, basically to recoup costs for drinking water contamination. That's a very new lawsuit, and it is, like so many others, in federal court in South Carolina.
It just seems to me, listening to what both of you are talking about and knowing the situation here in New Mexico, that such a huge burden is placed on the state, whether it's to try to compel cleanup or perform studies or figure out ways to get clean water into people's homes. And, it's extraordinary to think about the amount of taxpayer money, whether federal or state, that goes into polluting the water in the first place and then trying to figure out how to clean it up. One of the things that happened here in the state recently was the state of New Mexico and the USGS started doing studies statewide, sampling from within our major rivers and groundwater, and found low levels of PFAS are pretty widespread in the state's waters. And Garrett, you recently covered PFAS in rainwater around the Great Lakes region. Is this a significant public health threat? Like, what do these studies tell us about what's happening?
So the rain study is sort of it's not peer reviewed yet. It's pending, that sort of thing, but it's done by a very credible research group that's funded jointly by the EPA and the government of Canada. It's an atmospheric deposition monitoring network in the Great Lakes, and what they found is surprisingly high levels of the contaminants at various sites around the Great Lakes. So they tested in Chicago, Cleveland. Those were two urban sites where they found, I think the data point they shared with me was 1,000 parts per trillion in over 2 weeks. So 2 weeks worth of rainwater added up to 1,000 parts per trillion in concentration, in Cleveland. And, with similarly high concentrations, I understand in Chicago. And then other, finding concentrations in remote areas as well. So there's a national lakeshore on the northwest corner of Michigan called Sleeping Bear Dunes. It's very popular, beautiful area. They found, surprisingly high concentrations in the, 100 to a couple hundred parts per trillion in Sleeping Bear Dunes. And there's no smokestacks around Sleeping Bear Dunes, right? And so it's got to come from somewhere. And so in terms of the public health threat, I guess the researchers, I talked to say, this isn't going to make someone, non-stick or right, by being out in this rain. But what it does is it just spreads this stuff everywhere. If it's falling in the rain, then it's falling on, cropland, it's falling on land that's used, and filtering into groundwater that's used for drinking water supplies. It's falling on the Great Lakes themselves, which are, an enormous source of drinking water for, I think 40 million people in the Midwest and in Canada. And so it could go a long way to explaining a lot of sort of small, lower detections that can't be traced to a source, but show up in various investigations, where, just sort of stumps the regulators, who want to try and sort of find a source for it, but they can't. But they're also, the data shows that it's there. As someone who works in the Great Lakes region and covers the Great Lakes, we've always, we're highly aware that like other states out west, look at these bodies of fresh water and think, gosh, that would be nice to have, especially in the middle of a drought and a extreme heat situation. I'm actually in the middle of working on a story right now that, analyzes data from the state of Michigan's regular sampling of Great Lakes based drinking water systems. And the conclusion is going to be that low detections are common in, systems that draw from the Great Lakes. And it can be, it can change. It can be 2 parts per trillion one month and 10 parts per trillion the next month. It sort of depends on their proximity to the river mouths and tributaries that bring the stuff to the Great Lakes from inland. So the lakes themselves are not pristine sources of drinking water by any stretch. They're going to probably at some point, those systems, may need to start looking at filtration. We're talking about systems like the city of Grand Rapids, where, I've drank that water for years and years. It's undetermined, I think, in terms of what something like the PFAS and rain, what the overall public health threat is, but it's definitely fair to say that it's, it adds to the accumulation of these chemicals in the environment and helps spread them around in ways that make it really difficult to remediate.
Right. So here in New Mexico, PFAS has not garnered a lot of attention or local media coverage. And I'm curious, in New Jersey and Michigan, what has public response and interest been in PFAS coverage?
Well, speaking for New Jersey, I'd say you get a pretty big response of concern from the immediate community wherever the given test is found or the given contamination is found. I'm not sure that the issue has permeated and grabbed the attention of the state's population at large. But for folks that show up one day with a violation notice on their door or a note in their annual consumer confidence report from their water system, it raises a lot of questions, and folks that look into it, it's not hard for people to figure out the health risks that are associated with PFAS. And once they learn about that, people care a lot.
How about Michigan?
Well, I think we're one of the states that's got more people who are paying attention to it. Just sort of by virtue of the fact that we have investigated this stuff pretty heavily over the last few years. I think across the state of Michigan, we're at something like 170 sites where there's known contamination above a certain level. They're sort of on the state's radar, and that doesn't even include the drinking water systems and various other investigations that are going on. So and as well as there's been a lot of reporting on it in the last few years, and I'm very proud of the work that I've done and we've done at MLive to try and raise the awareness and try and get this stuff out there. And it's been picked up and carried forward by other media outlets, big and small. And it's had impacts in ways. The awareness has led to things like high school students up in northern Michigan in a place called Pellston. They decided to be proactive and start testing their own local drinking water sources before the state was able to get around to it, and then they found the chemicals at concerningly high levels, and that got the attention of the state authorities, and now that it's being sort of addressed, and so that's sort of one of the more positive impacts of a populace that's a bit more educated about it. In Michigan, we went through the Flint drinking water crisis several years ago, and that really heightened people's awareness around drinking water specifically, but also environmental issues. Given that we're positioned in the middle of the Great Lakes, people tend to be very emotional around water and very just pay a lot more attention to environmental issues to some degree than I assume other states do. But all that being said, I still, talk to people on a regular basis, friends of mine, family members from around the state and elsewhere. And I bring it up and, they're like, PFAS, I've never heard of that, and then you get to explain to them this thing, and then that's how you have that conversation. So it's hit or miss, I think, place by place in Michigan, but overall I think we have a pretty, our state's population is pretty keen to it at this point.
So I have that conversation with more people than probably want to have that conversation with me about PFAS. And I'm curious, what have you each learned about PFAS that you kind of wished you just never knew?
In New Jersey, the State Department of Environmental Protection officials have said early and often that where you look for PFAS, you find it. And that has held true in the few years that I've been reporting on this now. I think recently I did some reporting on research done by state and federal scientists of new chemicals within the PFAS family that Solvay has been using in replacement of PFNA as supposed to be the safer alternative. These chemicals have been found to be to have their own health questions, and they've also been found to be pretty airborne. And so it's remarkable when you read a study that ties pollution as far away as New Hampshire to this chemical plant in South Jersey, and just the pervasiveness of these chemicals in the world around us. I mean, never mind the fact that they are in the majority of things in our household, but just the sheer how they end up in the environment, and to the extent to which it's something it's hard to shake.
Garrett, what do you wish you never knew?
Very similar to, what Michael just outlined, just the pervasiveness of it, and when you learn that, you start to inevitably question, your own exposures to it over time. Right. And so in college, I spent a lot of time delivering pizzas, working in a pizza place, and pizza boxes are, sort of one of these well-known types of food contact product that are coated with PFAS. And so I'm I'm assuming I've ingested a lot of it. I've been on various drinking water supplies, which have later been found to have, levels of it, not really high levels, but nonetheless, they're there. So you start to think about that, and you start to think about the way that, could affect you and could affect your loved ones and stuff. And it's just, it's hard to wrap your mind around it, right? And that's just, and then you start to think, there are some people who have been exposed to this stuff at just godly high amounts, and you really feel for those people. They've lost people, they deal with chronic health problems now, and it's a rough thing to deal with. Reporting on this over the last few years, I've seen affected people, residents, who found high levels of it in their water, who, realized, that their son, who was very young, was drinking really high levels of this stuff. And they appear to be going through a grieving process, right? To learn, to come to grips with that sort of thing. And so, it's just the idea that it's everywhere, that we just kind of recently figured out that these things are out there, and that's been the troubling aspect of it for me.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for your standout reporting on this. That serves not just your local communities, but for someone reading from another state is just really great reporting. So thank you for that, and thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us. I appreciate you're doing this.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, Laura. It's always a pleasure to hear from New Mexico PBS.